Welcome to the program. Colette Blount joins me. She is a 20-year veteran of the Charlottesville Albemarle Public Schools and served for 8 years on the Charlottesville City School Board. Colette, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Coy.
I am very glad you're here. So,
Thank you.
I want to talk about education in America today, your frontline experience in the public schools here in Central Virginia. We want to talk about what's working, what's not working. But before we do that, it would be irresponsible of me not to ask for your thoughts, as I'm asking everyone, about what has been in the headlines recently with the tragic shootings that have been on social media, the killings in Dallas. We learn more and more, it seems, every hour about what's been happening. And clearly, America has faced some traumatic episodes like this in the past, but here we find ourselves right in the middle of one. More senseless gun violence, more killings. And I'm curious, what crosses your mind when you see these stories and you hear about them? Mm-hmm. As a teacher who has worked with kids for many years, from and many of them kids from poor neighborhoods, marginalized neighborhoods, kids of color who deal with this kind of violence, some of whom you know personally have been victims of gun violence. What crosses your mind, Colette, when you read about this stuff?
I would say, Coy, ask myself, how am I complicit? What have I done in my life that could lead to that as an individual? And what have I done in my life that could have avoided that? And I listen for that answer. And then I broaden it and ask, what has my community done in this respect, Charlottesville? What has Virginia done towards this? What has the nation done? So there are different levels of complicity that I think we need to really ask, because when we do nothing, then we are complicit. And so as an educator,
it's certainly one of the great lessons of history.
Oh, very much.
One of the greatest lessons of history, that
very much.
When people look the other way, they're letting evil happen.
Right. And so as a teacher, you know, I think I ask my students to, on the individual level, how they treat each other in the classroom at that base level. And one of the things that I do as a teacher, or did, is to not condone any type of behavior that would have one person either bullying or putting him or herself above another person, and for that person to really look at that individual behavior, because that then scales out to how we then take responsibility. That's where it starts, right? That's where it does start. Right. And also it starts with the lessons from our parents and our neighboring collective communal parents as well. So the decisions made by our councils, the decisions made by our boards of supervisor, how do those perpetuate this complicity, the systems that they do or don't have in place? So on the very local level, I've looked to see what is it that I can do to change the systems of inequity.
And so much of it is systemic, right?
It is very systemic.
Because there are great people who wear the uniforms of law enforcement.
It is very
And there are great people who live in poor neighborhoods and people of color.
Right.
Just really good people.
Right.
And yet we continue to see this this violence. So what I was saying is there is a larger systemic thing going on here. And if you pull the camera way back, as you and I have discussed, in some ways this is a 400-year-old story.
Right.
And this is just how it looks in the 21st century, that we are seeing more violence perpetrated by white men of power on black men who don't have power.
It's the 21st century of lynching. And that you don't have on that scale any longer, but this is the equivalent. The incarceration rates, that's the equivalent form of how it looks in the 21st century. On a local level, it's things like even something as small as the increased rates of our local swimming pool, $4 to $6 for our children to go and swim over the summer. And that was an issue brought before City Council, and the person who spoke about that said that that was a grave injustice. And so you have things that begin to ostracize on the local level. You have ways of pushing out communities. That's how it looks on the local level for how our complicity is played out.
You just have a system set up where people of color and poor people, you sort of push them to the side, and
right.
You're going to live over there.
And expect there to be no fallout from that. And so that has been the modus operandi for the 400 years. My family was very involved in the civil rights movement, my father and mother back in the 60s. My older 3 siblings were the first to integrate an all-white public school in the affluent Ladue, Missouri community, and they had a lawsuit against that school division. They knew they were going to lose, but I brought that lawsuit in the classroom with my students, Blount versus Ladue, and I said that by the time I got there, the last of 5 children, all the overt actions by the staff, by the parents, by the students that were inflicted upon my older 3 siblings, those were then underground. And so those 400 years, people have fine-tuned how to finesse and get the same outcome, but do it very, some of it very blatantly by the recent activity, but a lot of it is
faceless.
It is.
It's systemic.
It can be, but then you can also say, for example, the decision to increase the swimming rates. Who was around that table when those rates were increased? For local Charlottesville kids, $4 if you're below 48 inches, and $6 if you're above 48 inches.
I don't understand why it's not free for a public school.
You would think. And after the wonderful swimming program that Mr. Hare, the Ben Hare Foundation, put in place to help all of our city school kids learn to swim, you have this, this occurrence. So who was around that table when that decision was made, and who wasn't around that table when that decision was made? And
so, we can say that about so many decisions.
About so many things.
Who's in the room, who's at the table.
Who's in the room and who's not in the room. Yeah. And that's why you have these events going on. For our penal system, who's in the room when we talk about restorative justice, who's not in the room. And the same thing for our classroom. Who's in the classroom, who's not in the classroom, and those sorts of things.
I feel very strongly that this is, and I've said this on Facebook many times, that the status quo cannot stand. Because if we don't do something now about the killings and about the violence and the gun violence and about the police brutality, if we don't do something, then we all have to be willing to admit that this isn't their problem, this is our problem. Right. That it may not be your kid or your neighborhood today, but it's your neighborhood and your kid tomorrow.
And I'm not an expert on this. My daughter actually is more of an expert than I, and that's the work that she did in New York with her social political leanings. My area is in the classroom, the day-to-day with students.
But let me ask you about that. Let me ask you about that, Colette. Let's talk about that. When you look at 20 years you spent in the classroom on the very front line of public education in America, right here in our community in Central Virginia. Share with us, if you can, I'm curious, what works, what's working, and what's not working? What can you point to and say, look, everybody, that's not working. We need to do something about that. And what can you point to and say, you know, we should be very proud, this does work. Mm-hmm. Because often, and the reason I'm asking this is because often we have people with the greatest of intentions who find themselves up against a system that still fails the people it was created to serve. That's true for law enforcement, it's true for public education. So share with us, just speak as candidly as you can. What's working, what's not working?
I will start with the positive. What's working is that children are amazing. Children are beautiful, they're creative, they have the capability of human transgressions and the learnings from that. And the classroom is a microcosm of what works and how we make our mistakes and how we learn from them and how we then move on. And so it's a retrograde type of environment. Students will make progress and then they'll go back, and I've taught integers based on that type of movement and growth. What isn't working is more of the collective, the systemic approach to education. What also is working, but more for a select group, is that the people who have access to means and by way of their lineage, by the graces of their birth and their parentage, those folks I have seen continue to get their coffers filled to the point that they are actually overflowing to excess, and almost to greed. But that's not coming from the children's point. It's this collective lens of how we're really looking at it, that those who don't have this access to almost what I would call on the far end access to excess, but access just to basic amenities, that we sometimes look at that and say, there's nothing I can do about that. And that again comes back to our responsibility as humans. How much do we give to what the people we call our immediate family? And I think we need to broaden who we consider our family. And it's not just our blood, and it's not just the people in our 3-block radius. It is our greater society. It is those kids who have to pay the $4 and $6. Even though we might have unlimited funds, that should be seen as an injustice. And you have to understand why $4 or $6 is a large amount. As a teacher, I've always lived paycheck to paycheck. And $4 or $6 for me, for my daughter, who might have wanted to have gone every day to swim, that would not have been a possibility. And like you say, it should be free. That is an injustice, and it should be righted. And so, as the times changed and our political structure changed across those 400 years, and who had access to education, who was able to walk in the doors, what were those barriers, and we now think all those barriers have disappeared. They have not. And so as a teacher, before I got on the school board, I tried to really see what could I do to affect change in my students' lives, and that was more in the individual level. And so I then moved to the broader, for the policy level, for the school board. But it's not just Charlottesville, it's not just Albemarle County proper. I also taught in New York, and I also taught in Boston. And that same thing is happening nationwide. Who has access to quality education? And once they do have perhaps access, what is occurring there? And so we spoke a little bit before about the teaching body and who are our teachers in today's climate. And I think in regards to that, if you're going to teach a diverse group of people, and diverse by race, by gender, by economic background, by life experience, one, I believe, should have as much of experience with all of those different variables as possible. So if one has lived one's life in isolation in their community of sorts, their economic community, their racial community, their religious community, whatever their particular community is, but they go into a diverse setting, I think there's a disconnect, and I have seen that disconnect. I've seen well-intentioned teachers, but in order to really convey and get to the humanity of their students, You have to see past the student who doesn't have clean clothes, the student who is late in the morning, who has his or her head down because they were up all night in the emergency room with a parent, and having to understand the conditions of poverty. And I have firsthand experience with that well before paycheck to paycheck personally. But
I don't imagine that's the kind of thing you can teach at the Curry School of Education at UVA.
It isn't. It's not.
That's not in the textbooks.
It's not. And you have to go out there, and it's not something to be experienced, one type of dalliance. Oh, I did this experience, or I dug a hole next to somebody who didn't have, running water, and we shook hands, or that sort of thing. You have to actually, people have their different ways of how they find their levels of humanitarianism.
But you're seeing that as a deficit among school teachers today in the schools. There's this a culture gap.
Only a deficit in that who they're working with. If they are teaching of their own kind, so to speak, and I use that very, very broadly, of their own kind.
Yeah, but I know what you mean.
Then it can work. But when going, and that's why sometimes the rate of exit by a lot of new teachers can be very high in our public schools, because it is a completely different world, and you have to know how to navigate it. And that form of navigation, again, can be in the written word, but the written word doesn't necessarily get to the heartstrings.
Let me ask you this. Is this one of the reasons that we hear alumni, the living alumni who were in public schools before desegregation, speak of their teachers in a way that they would speak of a family member or a grandmother or a mother? And it's really striking to me. They talk about the experiences that they had. These alumni, people of color, when they talk about, oh, when I went to the Jefferson, the all-black school, let me tell you about the teacher. And I hear them talk about a way, they talk about that classroom and that experience in a way that you never hear the older white person talk about, oh, when I was in school in the 50s. It's very different.
Sure. My mother spoke of that. She grew up in Hampton, segregated schools. And I know what that is. It's, again, that heartstrings. It's one's ability to connect to another person. And back during the days of segregation, when African American citizens were trying to, were entering the educational field, sometimes for the first time in mass, perhaps in the 60s. Prior to that, but in the 60s, the integration and all of that, you had to, well, one thing, I'll backtrack a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
As a teacher, you have to love your students. You have to love them. And I have one daughter whom I love dearly, and I've taught over 1,500 children, and I have loved them dearly. Some we've had our issues with, but I still have cared for them and have wanted the best for them, and holding them to very high standards. More than even just teaching them, I have imparted to my students, I care for you. Those were the words that I imparted to Jarvis Brown when he was one of my students back in middle school about 15 years ago, maybe about 12 years ago, that I had to protect all of my students when he was bothering some of the kids in the classroom. I had to protect all of my students, including him. And the students have to, and the students are very astute. Kids from an early age, and I've spent some time nannying since I've retired from teaching, and I've worked with toddlers and things like that.
I don't mean to interrupt you. Why does Jarvis Brown come to mind? Why do you mention him specifically?
Jarvis, because he was Charlottesville's only murder in 2013. And of the 1,500 kids that I have taught, there are about 5 that I know by name and that are like my children. And he was actually #1 over the years. Jarvis and I worked over the course of a school year for him to be able to see his gifts. He was an amazing artist. He was an amazing joke teller, sometimes a little off color, sometimes not timed appropriately in the middle of a lesson. But he would teach me to laugh in the middle of a lesson because the joke was so spot on. But he would also get into other people's space, and he would take their items, he would shout, he would push. So we had a lot of conversations out in the hallway. So I brought in and I showed him his gifts, and I said, you know, you're so smart. You're too smart for this type of behavior. And Jarvis looked at me like that, and I said, you know, you're smart, right? And he may have cursed something and stalked off, and it was like, oh, he doesn't see his gifts. So rather than lessons on diagramming, rather than parts of speech and things like that, I wanted him to see what his gifts were and to own them. So every now and then, a few weeks would go by, and I would ask him, can you tell me? And maybe he didn't curse, but he would maybe just look at me and stalk off. And every now and then, it went back and forth 2 or 3 times over the course of the year. And on the last day of school, when kids are rushing out for summer vacation, the classroom door opens. It's a half day of school. I didn't have Jarvis's class that day. And I look up and it's him. And I just look at him and I just say, can you tell me? And he mumbles something. And I say, come closer, I can't hear you. And he looks down at the ground and says, I am smart. And I say, in my eyes. And he says, I am smart. And I gave him a big bear hug, even though you're not supposed to hug children. That warranted it. And I said, go off, have a great summer. Continue to tell your jokes, do the artwork. And I would see Jarvis in and out over the years. That was in 7th grade. I was his language arts teacher at Jack Jewett. And I would see him and I would ask him if he was still telling his jokes and things like that, and he couldn't quite look me in the eye. And in 2013, that was Charlottesville's only murder. And I spoke with a teacher who taught
Jarvis was killed.
Jarvis was murdered, shot. And I talked with a teacher who taught him in high school. And she also taught the young man convicted of his murder. And she said to me, you know, as much as Jarvis was a good boy, so was this boy. And that's why I went into education in the first place, Coy, that the systems that are in place, that have been in place for these 400 years, they are alive and well. And what I could do on an individual level is to try to help my students see their gifts, see the gifts of their respective classmates, respect those gifts, honor the differences, respect the differences, and take that out into the world to make a difference that way. And so it was also the reason why I left education after 20 years. It was beginning to break my heart. I was beginning to see my students across the news, not in a good way. And so, and that was why I also went onto the school board to try and effect a change policy-wide, a greater division-wide, to see what we could do to help those who, we've done enough for the kids who have access to plenty, and some who have access to excess. But we have a long way to go to help those who are barely scraping by. I taught a little girl who's now probably about 17, who was so nervous by the age of 6, she chewed off her fingerprints. She was so upset. Her home life was what it was. It was not a home life where there was access to excess. And the schools are filled with kids like that. Our schools are filled with kids like that.
So then answer the question that person right there is sitting there wondering, how do we help these children? What do we do? The kid who's from the great family, who's studying violin and going to lacrosse practice, and their parents are always wanting more services, and they'll be fine.
They'll be fine.
They've got great opportunities. They get it. How do we help all of these kids who continue, despite our best efforts, continue to fall through the cracks because the system doesn't serve them?
Well, actually, where they won't be fine is what the parents haven't given them. And that is the ability to speak the language of being human. They might have given them all the Shakespeare, they might have given them all the swim lessons and lacrosse practices, all of those things. Those things are those things are the dessert, and they haven't given them the nutritional basics of actually how to be a human. And so they're actually mirroring for their own children how to disregard and be blind to their neighbors. So when the other kids who are at that pool, who have paid the $4 and $6 to get in, and they're children, and they're enjoying the water and things like that, it's what they're not seeing as well. And it's also how those systems get perpetuated. So those kids are actually being done a disservice as well. But for those who are struggling to even survive, it's what we ask ourselves. You know, are we the people who give at the holiday time? Come November, December, are we looking for that tax break? Are we looking to see, hey, is that organization is nonprofit tax deductible? It's something that we think we can turn on and off. But it's a way of how we actually live our lives daily.
Well, and there are decisions made in Washington and in Richmond and at the Charlottesville City Hall, the Albemarle County Board of Supervisors, that continue to sustain a system that does not serve. It's not that it doesn't serve poor people and people of color, it's that it continues to punish them. It continues to cripple opportunities. It continues to keep the walls up, despite the rhetoric, despite the good intentions. So many of these kids are continuing to fall through the cracks, intentionally so, as if intended.
So it's who we have in place. It's who is making these decisions, who's sitting behind, up on the dais, who's behind the desk. And politics, and this might come as a little bit of a surprise, I'm actually an introvert. I'd much rather be home.
I know you are out of your comfort zone doing this right here, right now, and I appreciate you, and we appreciate you.
But knowing and seeing these systems in place will bring me out, and hopefully a lot of other people out. We have to get out of being comfortable for our day-to-day. Are my bills paid? Do I have food? Do I have a nice vacation I'm going to? Are my kids happy? Are they clean? Are their clothes clean with the Clorox bleach remover and all of that? And are they all pristine and proper and know all those things? It's who we elect. It's who wants to go in public office into a system that I see as very flawed and has failed for centuries. And we're trying to rectify that, but in a very backwards kind of way.
And there's no quick fix to this, we should say. There's no, you know.
If enough people wake up and there's a groundswell, if enough people come out of their stupor and see what they do on the day-to-day or what they don't do on the day-to-day, they might not be the ones who actively are the ones behind the guns doing this violence, but the laws they support, the legislators that they support and back,
they can start to see their complicity.
They become complicit, and if you do nothing, you are complicit. There's a different, and there's shades of complicity.
Colette, thank you for your service to this community. And for being here today.
Thank you, Coy.
I really appreciate it.
Fun.
Thank you. Colette Blount, she's a 20-year veteran of the public schools here in Charlottesville and Albemarle County in Central Virginia, and served for 8 years on the Charlottesville School Board. I'm Coy Barefoot. You can find the complete archive of our program online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Have a great week, and you all be good to each other.